Imagine a world where every day feels like a haunting echo of the last, where time moves only in the faint light that trickles through cracks in a decaying structure. A world where men, isolated from the outside, exist under a twisted legacy, imprisoned not just by physical barriers, but by a man-made ideology so dark it defies belief. This is the story of the Blackwood family, a reclusive clan whose world of secrecy and captivity was kept hidden for generations. In a small, forgotten barn in Oakage, Oregon, 7 men lived in silence, their faces haunted by the scars of years of genetic manipulation and isolation. For decades, their story went untold. But in 1997, the door to their prison was forced open, and what the world uncovered shook the foundations of everything we thought we knew about cruelty, survival, and the darkest corners of human belief. Join us as we unravel the horrifying truth behind the Blackwood family's generational nightmare, the psychological and biological scars left in its wake, and the ongoing battle for healing and justice that continues to echo through time. Before we dive deep into the story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Please don't forget to mention which country you're watching this video from. Do let us know in the comments. The morning of October 17, 1997, began quietly in the isolated town of Oakage, Oregon. The sun barely pierced the thick fog, casting an eerie stillness over the small town nestled in the mountains. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins sat in his office, sipping lukewarm coffee, the sound of the clock ticking the only break in the silence. His routine was peaceful, with little to disturb the calm of the day. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, its static sharp and unsettling. A voice came through, low and strained, giving no name but delivering a chilling message. "There's something wrong in that barn. I hear screaming. It's human." The call came from a local resident who claimed to hear sounds from the Blackwood farm, a property few knew well. The Blackwoods were a reclusive family, long shrouded in mystery, isolated from the world for decades. Few in Oakage had ever seen the Blackwoods, and even fewer spoke of them. The family's land was hidden deep within the woods, their presence barely acknowledged by anyone outside of their small, confined world. Sheriff Wilkins and his deputies prepared for the worst, gathering their gear before setting out on the winding forest road that led to the Blackwood property. It was a journey made with heavy hearts, their curiosity growing. As they approached the property, it was clear something wasn't right. A faded barn stood in the distance, seemingly abandoned, yet a sense of foreboding hung in the air. The land around it was eerily silent. The barn was locked, sealed shut by thick chains and heavy locks. The deputies stood in front of it, unsure of what awaited them inside. A foul, unfamiliar smell lingered in the air, making their stomachs churn. When the locks finally fell away, the barn door creaked open, revealing an interior that seemed trapped in time. The dim light that filtered through the cracks cast long, haunting shadows on the floor. Inside, 7 men stood motionless. They were disfigured, their faces marked by years of neglect and abuse. Their eyes stared blankly ahead, expressionless, like reflections of their father and uncle, twisted echoes of their captors. The officers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. The men didn't scream, didn't beg for help. They merely stared, their vacant gazes fixed on the deputies as though they had never encountered the outside world. The barn wasn't a home. It was a prison. The men were confined to makeshift straw beds, surrounded by crude, handmade tools and buckets used as toilets. This was no farm. It was a cage built for control. The further they explored, the more unsettling the scene became. The barn's walls were covered with strange notes, markings, and drawings, indications of an existence created under the rule of one mind, driven by obsessive control. The design of the barn itself was telling. Reinforced walls, sealed windows, and doors that could only be opened from the outside. It was clear the structure had been constructed for captivity, with no regard for comfort or freedom. The deputies moved quickly, removing the men from the barn and transporting them to a nearby medical facility. The physical toll was evident. Elongated features, pale skin, vacant expressions, but the mental scars ran far deeper than anyone expected. Doctors and experts were brought in to assess the men's condition. The results were shocking. Years of inbreeding had caused severe genetic disorders, with deformities ranging from extra fingers to malformed organs, and mental impairments that couldn't be ignored. The most disturbing discovery, however, was the journals. They belonged to the patriarch, Jeremiah Blackwood. Inside the pages, detailed notes outlined his vision for the family. A twisted philosophy based on genetic purity and control. Jeremiah's journals painted a picture of a man who believed himself to be a visionary, someone who was crafting the perfect lineage. He didn't see his actions as imprisonment. He believed he was saving his family from outside contamination. This wasn't just neglect. It was a methodical, deliberate system of control. The men were treated as nothing more than vessels, instruments for the continuation of a bloodline that Jeremiah believed was superior and untouched by the outside world. As investigators dug deeper into the Blackwood property, they uncovered disturbing evidence of how Jeremiah had orchestrated the entire family's existence. The barn wasn't a makeshift solution. It was a carefully constructed prison designed for breeding and isolation. The more authorities uncovered, the clearer it became that the Blackwood family's isolation wasn't accidental. It was the culmination of a long-held belief system that saw the outside world as corrupt and dangerous, while their bloodline was pure and sacred. The authorities were left with a grim realization. The Blackwoods had lived in complete isolation for decades, hidden from the world. Their lives, their suffering, and their twisted reality had gone unnoticed for far too long. The discovery of the Blackwood men would change everything. It would force the world to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, obsession, and the destructive power of a mind unchecked. But it would also spark a journey of healing and justice. The Blackwood family's history stretched back nearly a century, buried in the rural corners of Oregon. The Blackwoods were not just isolated from society, they were detached by a world view that saw the outside as a threat. In 1931, during the Great Depression, Elijah Blackwood bought a piece of land on the outskirts of Oakridge. The property had a tragic past, having once been owned by a family who met a violent end. Local folklore whispered that the land was cursed, forever tainted by the horrors that had unfolded there. But for Elijah, it was a fresh start, a place to retreat from a world that had abandoned him. Elijah arrived with his wife and 5 children, and for a while, they lived quietly, with minimal contact with the outside world. Their presence was barely acknowledged by the townspeople, who slowly forgot about them. Over the years, the Blackwoods' seclusion deepened. Their children were withdrawn, distant, and polite, but showed no interest in the community. They rarely ventured into town, and when they did, it was under mysterious circumstances. By 1943, the world was at war, and the government sent military officers to rural areas to recruit soldiers. When they came to the Blackwood farm, Elijah met them with a shotgun, refusing to let his sons serve. This incident marked the beginning of the Blackwoods' total isolation from society. They retreated further into the woods, leaving behind any remaining ties to the world they once knew. To them, outsiders were corrupt and dangerous. Through the years, Elijah's worldview became darker. His children rarely interacted with others, and the family's relationship with the outside world became increasingly strained. They saw the modern world as a place of decay and destruction. In the 1950s, Elijah's son Harold took over the family's beliefs. He married his second cousin, Rebecca, who was never seen by anyone outside the farm. Her existence remained a secret, her family cut off from communication. Between 1953 and 1962, Rebecca gave birth to 6 children. Only 3 survived. The deaths of the others were dismissed as natural defects, and their births continued under the guise of family preservation and maintaining a strong bloodline. Jeremiah Blackwood, Harold's son, was born into this world of isolation. By the time he was in his 20s, he had adopted the belief system of his father, but with a darker, more deliberate approach to controlling the family's future. When Harold died in 1978, Jeremiah took control of the family's land. His vision was clear. He would continue what his father started, but with a new purpose: complete control over the bloodline, a genetic experiment conducted in secrecy. In 1983, Jeremiah made his most significant purchases: seeds, tools, and supplies necessary for his plan. This wasn't preparation for a harvest. It was the foundation for generations of isolation, breeding, and genetic manipulation. Jeremiah's obsession with blood purity grew more intense. He believed the outside world was filled with contamination, and he saw himself as the protector of a pure lineage. His goal wasn't just survival, it was genetic refinement. He began building the barn, not as a storage facility, but as a prison designed for complete control over reproduction. Every detail of its design was calculated: reinforced walls, sealed windows, and doors that could only be opened from the outside. The men born into this system were raised under strict rules. They lived in isolation, subjected to the whims of their patriarch. They were forced into a cycle of breeding that had no room for deviation, only conformity. Jeremiah's journals revealed his twisted rationale. He saw his actions as necessary for preserving the family line, convinced that the Blackwoods were superior. Every child born was a step toward the creation of the perfect human form. What seemed to the outside world as a family trapped in time was actually a carefully constructed experiment. Jeremiah didn't see the suffering he caused as abuse. It was the price of creating a stronger, purer bloodline. The discovery of the men in the barn revealed the horrific consequences of Jeremiah's vision. The men's physical and mental deformities were not just the result of neglect, they were the results of years of calculated inbreeding and genetic manipulation. Behind the closed doors of the barn, the men lived a life devoid of education, comfort, or freedom. Their world was restricted to the confines of the barn, a prison that erased any notion of individuality or connection to the outside world. As investigators combed through the property, they found evidence of how deeply Jeremiah had integrated his beliefs into every aspect of the Blackwood life. It wasn't just captivity. It was an experiment in creating a pure bloodline, one that would live outside the corruption of modern society. The Blackwood men, though physically alive, were the product of generations of suffering. They were victims of a delusional belief system that saw control as salvation and isolation as the only path to purity. But in the end, they were more than just captives. Jeremiah Blackwood believed he was saving his family, but in reality, he had condemned them to a life of unimaginable suffering. His vision had led to the collapse of the Blackwood family, turning their bloodline into a tragic example of the dangers of unchecked ideology. The Blackwood farm was like a forgotten relic, existing in a place that had long been forgotten by time. For generations, the family lived without contact, shielded from the outside world by both physical and ideological barriers. As the years passed, the Blackwoods remained entirely cut off from society, rejecting any notion of modernity. To them, the outside world was not just corrupt, it was a plague that threatened their very existence. Their world was small, confined to the land they owned, and their interactions were limited to one another. The Blackwoods believed that by isolating themselves, they could preserve their family's purity and avoid contamination. The barn where the men were found was more than just a shelter, it was their world. There was no outside influence, no distractions, just the constant repetition of survival, dictated by the whims of their patriarch, Jeremiah. Jeremiah's control was complete. He orchestrated everything, from the men's daily routines to the breeding cycles he imposed. His belief in genetic purity meant that every decision was made with a singular focus: the continuation of his bloodline. There were no luxuries, no indulgences, only the strictest routines. The men's lives revolved around the barn, where they lived in separate, cramped quarters with little more than straw to sleep on and minimal interaction with one another. The world outside was nothing more than a distant myth. The Blackwood men had no concept of modern technology, politics, or even basic human rights. They existed in a vacuum, their lives determined by the dictates of their father. Jeremiah had isolated them so thoroughly that escape was not just impossible, it was inconceivable. The men had never known anything else. The barn had become their entire reality, and the thought of leaving it was beyond comprehension. The most shocking revelation was not just the physical captivity, but the mental isolation. The men were trained to believe that the outside world was sick, poisoned by radiation, disease, and decay. They were taught that their bloodline was the only hope for humanity. What they didn't know, however, was that this was all a lie. The world beyond the barn was not as Jeremiah had described. It was not a wasteland, but a place full of life, change, and possibility. Their entire understanding of reality had been manipulated. Jeremiah had created a false narrative that confined them within the walls of the barn. The outside world was never a threat. It was simply a place they were never allowed to explore. As the men grew older, they began to notice the cracks in Jeremiah's carefully constructed reality. Small things, changes in the environment, unfamiliar noises, but they had no way of understanding what was truly happening beyond their prison. Some of the men, like Sarah, began to ask questions, but their voices were often silenced. Jeremiah had created a culture of obedience and fear. To question his authority was to risk punishment, rejection, or worse, complete isolation. Their only knowledge of the world came from the fragments of information that Jeremiah allowed them to hear. He controlled what they knew and when they knew it, keeping them locked in a psychological cage as much as a physical one. The walls of the barn became a barrier not just to the outside world, but to their own growth. They were denied the chance to develop fully as individuals, their identities shaped by their captivity and the twisted legacy of their father. Jeremiah's obsession with control was all-consuming. The men were nothing more than instruments for his vision of a pure, untainted bloodline. Each one was a cog in the machine, their lives determined by the genetic requirements of their father's twisted experiment. It wasn't just the physical isolation that hurt them, it was the emotional and psychological toll. The men were raised without love, without connection. They existed only to serve the will of a man who saw them as little more than vessels for his beliefs. Their lives were a repetition of tasks, rituals, and breeding cycles, each one more suffocating than the last. They were taught that this was normal, that the world outside was not worth knowing, and that their captivity was a form of salvation. But deep inside, despite the years of conditioning, a small part of them knew that something was wrong. They were not meant to live this way, trapped within the confines of the barn, isolated from the world that others took for granted. It was only when law enforcement finally intervened that the full scale of the Blackwood family's captivity was revealed. The men were rescued from a life that had been controlled, manipulated, and dictated by one man's delusional vision of purity and salvation. The outside world, which had seemed so distant and threatening, now loomed large. The men were introduced to a reality they had never known, one full of noise, color, and chaos, a stark contrast to the silence and control they had been raised in. When authorities finally entered the Blackwood property, the sense of unease was overwhelming. The barn wasn't just a shelter, it was a monument to control, a place built for the sole purpose of confinement. Inside, the men were discovered in a state that defied comprehension. Their faces, while human, carried a disturbing resemblance to one another. Their features were elongated, their expressions vacant, as if they had never learned to feel. The barn's design spoke volumes. The small, cramped quarters, the reinforced doors, the windows that could never open, the entire structure was built with one goal in mind: total and absolute control over the lives within it. The men stood in silence, as if their very existence had been reduced to a routine of observation and survival. There was no joy, no rebellion, only a hollow acceptance of the life they had been given. As investigators explored the barn, they discovered that it wasn't just a prison. It was a laboratory, one where Jeremiah Blackwood had experimented with every aspect of life. The men were not just prisoners. They were his creations. Jeremiah had meticulously kept journals, filled with notes about the genetic traits he wanted to preserve. Each entry reflected his obsession with purity, with strengthening the bloodline. The men were nothing more than instruments to achieve this vision. What shocked the investigators wasn't just the men's condition. It was the deliberate nature of the experiment. The Blackwoods weren't just living in isolation. They were part of a twisted, calculated breeding program. Jeremiah believed that the outside world was corrupt, that humanity had fallen into decay. His solution was simple: to remove his family from it entirely, to create a new lineage untouched by what he saw as the world's flaws. The men were raised to believe they were special, that they carried the purest bloodline. They were taught that the world outside was poisoned, that their only purpose was to preserve their family's legacy of genetic superiority. Yet, behind their disfigured faces and vacant stares, there was a tragic truth. The men weren't strong or pure. Their genetics had been irreparably damaged by decades of inbreeding and isolation, leaving them physically and mentally broken. Even more disturbing was the psychological damage. The men had been conditioned to see the outside world as a dangerous, hostile place. Their minds had been warped by years of manipulation, leaving them with a narrow, distorted view of reality. When medical professionals examined the men, the results were nothing short of horrific. The men had multiple genetic deformities: extra fingers, fused limbs, malformed organs, all signs of the deep and irrevocable damage done to their bodies over generations of inbreeding. But it wasn't just their bodies that had been affected. The men displayed signs of extreme psychological trauma. Many couldn't understand basic concepts, while others displayed a disturbing lack of empathy or emotional response to the world around them. Their only interactions had been with each other and their father. Jeremiah's control over their lives had been total. They were his creations, and they existed only to fulfill his twisted vision of a pure, untainted bloodline. The men had never been taught the basics of human society. They didn't understand money, technology, or even basic communication beyond their small, isolated world. Their language had become primitive, shaped by years of isolation. When they were finally taken to medical facilities, the staff was faced with a daunting task. The physical and psychological recovery would take years, but more than that, the men had to be reintroduced to the world. Their recovery was slow and painful. The men had to learn how to function in a world they had never known, and even the smallest changes, like seeing a television or using a telephone, were overwhelming to them. The process of reintegration into society was fraught with challenges. Some of the men struggled to understand basic social norms, while others faced deep emotional scars that couldn't be healed by any amount of medical treatment. The world they had been taught to fear was now their reality. The men were forced to confront everything they had been denied: knowledge, freedom, connection. But it wasn't an easy transition. The damage done to them was deep, lasting. It was clear that the Blackwood men had been shaped by their captivity. Their identities were forged in isolation, and undoing the damage done by their father's twisted beliefs would take years of therapy and rehabilitation. Their story, however, was one of survival. Despite the cruelty they had endured, they had made it out. And though their journey of healing was just beginning, the Blackwood men had taken their first steps toward reclaiming their lives. When law enforcement finally breached the Blackwood barn, it wasn't just the physical structure that was locked away. It was the men's entire world, sealed tight by their father's obsessive need to control everything. The barn had become a cage, a structure built for confinement rather than comfort. Inside, the men were found standing motionless, their faces vacant, as if they had never been taught to feel or express anything. At first, the officers were paralyzed by the sight before them. The men seemed almost otherworldly, their features eerily similar to one another, their eyes hollow and void of understanding. It was as if time had stopped for them. There was no screaming, no pleading for help, just silence. The men didn't beg for freedom because they didn't know what freedom was. Their world had been nothing more than the confines of the barn for as long as they could remember. The more the officers investigated, the more they realized the extent of the isolation the men had endured. The barn was designed with meticulous detail, every aspect of it reinforcing the control and manipulation exerted by Jeremiah Blackwood. The barn wasn't just a place of captivity, it was a monument to Jeremiah's delusion. It had been constructed with one goal in mind: to erase any connection to the outside world and to create a self-sustaining, isolated bloodline. There was no electricity, no plumbing, and no outside communication. The men had never known anything beyond their small, cramped world. The barn became both their prison and their entire existence, a reality that had been forced upon them. Investigators uncovered journals hidden throughout the barn. Jeremiah had meticulously recorded everything, from the men's physical traits to their breeding cycles. These were not just records of family history, they were an obsessive, calculated plan for genetic purity. Jeremiah's twisted belief in genetic superiority had guided every decision. He saw the men as nothing more than tools to continue his vision, a vision that disregarded their humanity in favor of preserving his pure bloodline. The men, however, had no knowledge of this plan. They had been raised in complete isolation, their identities shaped entirely by their father's warped ideas. They had no concept of the world beyond the barn, and they certainly didn't understand their own suffering. The barn was filled with drawings, scraps of notes, and strange markings on the walls, evidence of a life lived without any real education or understanding of the world. It was clear that the men had never been taught to think beyond the walls of their prison. The psychological effects of the men's isolation were profound. They didn't just lack knowledge, they lacked any sense of self. They had been conditioned to see themselves only through the lens of their father's delusions. There was no room for individuality. The physical toll was equally devastating. The men showed signs of severe genetic deformities resulting from years of inbreeding. Extra fingers, fused limbs, and malformed organs were just some of the visible effects of their father's twisted breeding program. The men's cognitive abilities were similarly affected. Many struggled to understand basic concepts, unable to grasp the simplest ideas that would have been second nature to anyone raised in the outside world. They had been kept in a mental prison as well. Yet even in their condition, there were signs of resilience. Some of the men had managed to learn basic skills, albeit through makeshift methods. One of them had taught himself to read, using the Bible and agricultural manuals as his only resources. Their escape from the barn was just the beginning of a long journey. They had been forced into a reality so foreign to them that it took time for them to even begin to process the outside world and its complexities. The men had been taught that the world beyond the barn was a place of sickness, radiation, and decay. They had been told that their bloodline was the only hope for humanity, and they believed this with the kind of certainty that comes from years of isolation. Now, in a world that was full of noise, movement, and people, the men found themselves overwhelmed. Simple things like a car driving by or the hum of an electric light were foreign and unsettling. The road to recovery was long and difficult. The men had to be taught everything: how to speak to others, how to interact with technology, how to function in a world that was both overwhelming and incomprehensible to them. Despite the difficulties, there was hope. The men were receiving medical care and therapy, and for the first time, they were surrounded by people who didn't see them as experiments, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The Blackwood case forced society to confront a harsh truth: that there are dark, hidden corners where families can fall prey to ideologies so dangerous that they erase the humanity of those they claim to protect. The men's journey toward recovery was painful, but it was also a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, there can be light. Their story, though marked by tragedy, was also one of survival and the possibility of healing. The journals of Jeremiah Blackwood provided a chilling window into his twisted beliefs. They revealed the meticulous, obsessive nature of his plan to create a pure bloodline, one that would remain untouched by the outside world. Jeremiah viewed his actions as a noble effort, convinced that he was saving his family from the corruption of society. His writings revealed how deeply entrenched his delusions were, shaping everything from his daily routines to his control over the men's lives. His journals contained a disturbing amount of detail about his breeding program. Each pairing was planned with precision, aimed at preserving traits he deemed valuable. Physical traits, mental traits, and even emotional traits he believed contributed to his family's purity. Jeremiah didn't see his family as individuals. He saw them as tools, vessels for his plan. He manipulated the men's lives to suit his vision, imposing a rigid structure that left no room for personal freedom or choice. Every aspect of their existence had been shaped by Jeremiah's delusion. From the way they were raised to the way they were isolated, nothing was left to chance. The men's world was controlled by a single mind, Jeremiah's. The men had been raised to believe they were special, chosen. They were told their bloodline was the only one that mattered, that their existence was vital for the survival of humanity. This belief was drilled into them from birth, but the truth was far darker. The Blackwood men weren't special. They were victims. Jeremiah's obsession with controlling their bloodline had led to their suffering, both physically and mentally. Their genetic makeup had been irreparably damaged. The men had no understanding of their condition. They didn't know that their deformities were the result of years of inbreeding. They didn't understand that their lack of education was due to years of isolation, kept away from the outside world. As investigators pored over Jeremiah's journals, they were horrified by the extent of his delusions. He had kept track of the men's traits, noting every detail of their appearance and behavior, believing that he was shaping the future of humanity. The journals were filled with charts, graphs, and calculations. Jeremiah had treated his family like lab subjects, recording everything with a detached, scientific approach. For him, the men were nothing more than genetic experiments, not human beings. The discovery of these journals painted a clear picture of Jeremiah's belief system. He was convinced that by controlling every aspect of their lives, he was creating a stronger, purer lineage. But in reality, he was destroying them. The Blackwood men had been raised in a reality that was nothing more than a series of lies. Jeremiah's control over their lives had been so absolute that they couldn't imagine any other way of living. They believed they were fulfilling a higher purpose. The psychological damage was profound. The men had been taught to obey without question, to follow the rules set by their father without understanding why. There was no room for rebellion, no room for individuality or personal desires. Even after their rescue, the men struggled to understand the true nature of their past. The years of manipulation and isolation had left deep scars, and it would take years of therapy for them to process the full extent of their suffering. As the men began to heal, they started to question everything they had been taught. They began to ask why they had been treated this way, why they had been denied the opportunity to live normal lives. The recovery process wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and social. The men had to relearn how to interact with others, how to understand their place in the world, and how to navigate a society that was entirely foreign to them. Their journey was filled with setbacks, but also moments of progress. The men slowly started to understand that their lives weren't determined by their bloodline. They were free to choose their own paths, free to define their own futures. Jeremiah's legacy had been one of control, isolation, and suffering. But for the Blackwood men, their escape from the barn marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to rebuild their lives, to forge new identities, and to heal. In the years that followed, the Blackwood men continued to receive support, not just from medical professionals, but from a society that was beginning to understand the importance of helping victims of generational trauma. Their recovery became a symbol of resilience. As the Blackwood men began their recovery, the outside world took notice. Their story, though shocking, became a symbol of survival, a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, there is a possibility for healing. They were no longer just victims of their father's delusions. They were survivors. Their struggle to rebuild their lives was long and painful, but it was also a story of resilience and determination. The men had lived their entire lives in isolation, separated from the world they were now learning to navigate. Every step of their recovery was a challenge, but they were no longer trapped by their past. The process wasn't easy. Simple tasks that others took for granted, like using a phone or understanding how money worked, became monumental obstacles for the men. They had to be taught everything, from basic social interactions to practical skills. Yet, despite these challenges, there was progress. Slowly, the men began to grasp the complexities of the world outside the barn. They started to understand concepts like freedom, choice, and the value of human connection. They were given therapy, not just for their physical injuries, but for their emotional scars. The trauma they had endured was deep and pervasive, but with each session, they began to peel away the layers of pain and confusion. The men were introduced to society in stages. They were eased into the modern world, their exposure to new experiences gradual so they wouldn't be overwhelmed. But every new thing they encountered was a step toward healing. Their road to recovery was filled with setbacks, but there were also breakthroughs. Some of the men began to speak about their past, sharing the memories that had been locked away for so long. One of the most difficult parts of their journey was accepting the reality of their past. For years, they had been told that their captivity was normal, that they were fulfilling a higher purpose. Confronting the truth was painful, but as the men healed, they began to form new identities. They were no longer just part of a bloodline defined by isolation and control. They were individuals with their own dreams, hopes, and futures. The process of healing wasn't linear. Some of the men struggled more than others, haunted by the psychological effects of years of manipulation and abuse. But even in their struggles, they found strength. For the first time, the Blackwood men were given the opportunity to make their own choices. They could decide what kind of life they wanted to lead, what kind of person they wanted to become. Their story, once a tragic example of isolation and abuse, had become a source of inspiration. It showed that even in the most hopeless of circumstances, there is always the potential for change, for growth, for redemption. The men began to rebuild their relationships with the outside world, one small step at a time. They made connections with others, learning how to trust and communicate. And slowly, they started to find their place in society. Their recovery was also a reminder of the importance of community. It was through the support of professionals, advocates, and strangers who offered their help that the Blackwood men were able to begin their healing journey. As they continued their therapy, the men began to realize the true depth of their trauma, but they also began to understand that healing was possible, that they could move beyond their past and create a future for themselves. In time, the Blackwood men grew more confident. They found jobs, began to interact with the public, and slowly re-entered the world they had once been so isolated from. Their transformation was slow but undeniable. The legacy of their recovery became an important lesson for society, one about the dangers of isolation, the importance of empathy, and the capacity for change. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Though their journey wasn't over, The Blackwood men had taken the first steps toward reclaiming their lives. They were no longer defined by their past. They were free to shape their own futures. The Blackwood case had far-reaching effects that stretched beyond the men themselves. It became a pivotal moment in the conversation about child abuse, isolation, and the dangers of unchecked ideology. It prompted a nationwide reckoning. Legislators and social workers began to address the gaps in systems that allowed the Blackwood family to remain hidden for so long. Policies were created to ensure that such extreme isolation could never again go unnoticed. One of the key changes was the introduction of the Sarah Law, named after the eldest Blackwood man who had survived the ordeal. This law mandated more thorough oversight of homeschooling and isolated families, ensuring children's safety. Local authorities were trained to recognize signs of long-term captivity or abuse, particularly in remote areas. The Blackwood case highlighted the need for vigilance, even in seemingly quiet, isolated communities where such horrors could fester unseen. The scientific community also took notice of the Blackwood case. Medical researchers were granted access to the men's genetic data, providing invaluable insight into the effects of extreme inbreeding and the long-term impact of isolation on human development. Forensic geneticists analyzed the men's genomes, uncovering genetic loops, regions of the genome that had been passed down repeatedly, amplifying the effects of recessive genetic disorders. The research advanced understanding of rare genetic conditions. The ethical implications of studying the men's genetics were debated heavily. Some argued that it was crucial to understand the full scope of their condition, while others cautioned against using the men's trauma as a mere scientific case study. The Blackwood men's story became a cautionary tale that reached beyond academic circles. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of isolation, blind obedience, and the destructive consequences of letting one man's delusions shape an entire family. Yet, despite the pain of their past, the Blackwood men remained determined to forge new paths. Their journey from captivity to recovery became a symbol of strength, resilience, and the power of the human spirit to overcome unimaginable odds. While society debated the ethical implications of their case, the men focused on healing and rebuilding their lives. They found solace in their newfound freedom, but the scars of their past would remain with them forever. As the years passed, some of the men found stability in jobs, while others struggled to adapt to the complexities of modern life. Each man took his recovery at his own pace, guided by the support they had received. The bond between the men, though forged in captivity, remained strong. Despite their traumatic past, they supported one another in their healing journeys, and together they began to redefine what it meant to live free. The Blackwood family's legacy shifted from one of horror to one of hope. Their story was no longer just about abuse and isolation. It became a testament to the power of survival, the importance of community, and the capacity to rebuild. The men's story was also a wake-up call for the nation. It revealed the flaws in systems designed to protect children and prompted reforms that would help prevent future atrocities from slipping through the cracks. Though the world would never forget the horrors the Blackwood men had endured, it was the lessons learned from their case that would help shape a safer future for vulnerable families. Change, though painful, had begun. The men's recovery was long, but it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It showed that, even in the most extreme circumstances, there is always the possibility for healing, growth, and reintegration. Their lives would never be the same as they had once been, but in the end, the Blackwood men had reclaimed their freedom. They had learned to live again, and in many ways they were finally free. Their story was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a symbol of survival. The Blackwood men had found a way out of the darkness, and in doing so, they had become a beacon of hope for others who were suffering in silence.